German Colonization of Africa, presented by Grace and Greg, Chandler Grace Keegan, Emerson Rampey, Lily Hudson, and Henry Hughes. Primary source of social Darwinism. This primary source, which dates back to the late 19th century, depicts Germany and many other countries dividing Africa into pieces through imperialism. Germany, or Otto von Bismarck, is depicted in the corner cutting up the cake of Africa into many pieces, which symbolizes the division and colonization of Africa during this time period. Recently colonized in 1871, Germany is eager to colonize Africa as many other countries are during this period. Therefore, this political cartoon exemplifies the rationale of imperialism as social Darwinism, for Otto von Bismarck and many other German leaders felt that if they did not colonize, then they would lose European prestige and power. Primary source for a white man's burden. The Germans might have thought that they were doing something really good for Africa, but after they colonized Africa and the disease was spreading and the Emin Pasha expedition is launched, they thought that they were really bettering Africa. This is an exemplar of white man's burden, for the Germans thought they were aiding their African colonies when in reality they were abusing and overworking its inhabitants in order to produce the raw materials needed to industrialize. Another primary source. This primary source demonstrates the common rationale for imperialism, the white man's burden. According to the white man's burden, it is the job of the white man to educate and aid those of lesser civility and stature, non-whites, to ascendancy or improvement as a whole. It was commonly believed that it was the duty of the white man to guide the barbaric non-white subjects of the areas of potential colonization towards being more civilized and European. This was also the case in Germany, where Otto von Bismarck and many others thought it was vital for Germans to colonize Africa, not only for resources but also to educate and civilize them. The cartoon above demonstrates a white man carrying a black man up a hill to a house sitting on the top, which is symbolic of countries such as Germany feeling the need to aid Africans and take over their countries in order to lighten their own burden. Another primary source for white man's burden. This is a trade card which dates back to the late 19th century. It illustrates and explains the German perspective of the colonization of Africa and the white man's burden. The natives are being portrayed as evil, rebelling and betraying the colonists. In turn, this makes the colonists appear to be yet again burdened by the inhumane, uncivilized Africans. Therefore, this illustration accurately depicts the rationale that Germans must colonize Africa to civilize the natives, therefore it is their burden to do so. From 1750 to 1900, state expansion shifted as a result of German nationalism, unification, imperialism, and imperialism throughout Europe. Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Prussia, used realpolitik, which is practical politics, to both manipulate other countries such as France, Prussia, and Austria, which in turn fueled German territorial expansion during this time. As a result of their unification in 1871, state expansion shifted from expansion in Europe to exploiting lands in Africa, as many other countries were doing during this era. Germany used direct colonization to settle Cameroon. In 1884, an explorer named Gustav Nachtigall landed near Cameroon and spent the next few years extending German control over the colony. They engaged in direct trade with Germany, yet Cameroon was ruled by chartered companies, which meant that German companies ruled and owned Cameroon as their own colony. German East Africa began to be conquered by Germans in 1884, and it was originally governed by the German East Africa Company, who also managed the trade and exports of the colony. Later on, the German imperialist government took over the rule of the colony from the German East Africa Company. The German Southwest Africa colony was the first to be settled by Germany in April of 1884. When they realized that their government was weak, the German government took over the government of the new colony almost immediately, making it directly ruled by German officials until the Treaty of Paris in 1919. Germany is the teal color in this map, and the yellow, red, black, and green regions are Germany's colonies in Africa. Otto von Bismarck personally claimed that the German Otto von Bismarck personally claimed that the colony of Togoland to be Germany's. It had very little resources, so the Germans used it to export crops grown in the colony. Under the rule of the German government, the colony established a judicial and administrative system which they did not have before. Therefore, all of the German African colonies were ruled underneath German rule as a result of poor governments in the colonies. The Abushiri Revolt took place in Pangani in 1888, which is a German colony in East Africa. The volatility started when the German colonists lowered the Sultan of Zanzibar's flag and raised their own. There was already tension rising due to the colonists' disrupting of the native trade and mosque conduct. The revolt was ultimately a failure as it was crushed by the German explorer Hermann von Wissmann. The Abushiri and Mahi Mahi revolts are two of many, thus demonstrating the native discontent with Germany's imperialistic colonies. Though the Mahi Mahi revolt occurred after 1900, it is by far the most well-known revolt against German colonists in Africa. The revolt was in response to many new German policies such as forcing the indigenous people to grow cotton for export, as well as building roads, taxation, and the killing of any kings that opposed German occupation. The revolt is so well known due to the fatalities as well as the mass unification of indigenous groups. The revolt gets its name from a sacred water called Mahi Mahi that was said to repel German bullets. It was poured on top of heads and worn around the neck inside a bamboo capsule. Resistance in form of press was particularly prevalent in German East Africa. Until stricter press laws were made, a popular newspaper called the East African Standard commonly asked for peace among the colonies, otherwise the people would rebel. An example of German authority over East Africans is the forced labor among women in Germany, East Africa, and here's a photo of it. German areas of Southwest Africa, which is present-day Namibia, were colonized between 1884 and 1890. The area was twice the size of Germany, yet only a fraction of the people. It offered little promise for large-scale mineral or agricultural extraction. It became Germany's only real settler colony. By 1903, about 3,000 Germans settled in the colony, which disrupted the socio-economic balance of the area, resulting in conflict. Main points of contention were anti-colonial concern and access to scarce resources like land, water, and cattle. Of the little food resources that were available to the Hereros, there was an outbreak of the rinderpest. This not only took away the majority of the protein that was available, but it also harmed the Herero economy, as cattle herding was a large source of their wealth. The largest conflict between the Herero nation, a pastoral group who had developed several modern traits, such as the use of horses and guns, fighting began in 1904. It is unclear who shot first. Herero fighters laid siege to the German fort in Ogahandra. Fighting ensued over the following weeks in order to gain control of central high grounds. 123 settlers and soldiers were killed in the attacks. German staff in Berlin demanded a military solution. German von Trotha was appointed to take care of the Hereros. He arrived during a period where the Hereros fled to a distant area, allowing themselves to be surrounded by German soldiers. Von Trotha soldiers attacked on August 11, 1904, launching artillery shell after shell upon the Hereros, meeting the fleeing Hereros with machine gun fire. Some Hereros escaped through a gap in German flank, and von Trotha pursued them into the desert. By the time that von Trotha could no longer pursue the Hereros, it's estimated that about 75% of the Herero population was killed, one of the most effective genocides in history.
The significance of wool in its revenue in Africa is exemplified through the movement of the governor Friedrich von Lindequist, a high colonel of the German Reich, and eventually the governor of the German West South Africa. There, he introduced a large trading system which he ran himself. Later on, Friedrich von Lindequist moved to West South Africa and made a lot more money than he could have in Germany. In turn, he largely benefited from his own system, which made him one of the richest and most powerful people in West South Africa. This chart illustrates the GDP of East Africa from 1796 to 1950. In the chart, it illustrates the GDP decreasing in East Africa between 1880 and 1920, which is the time period in which Germany colonized a section of Africa. Therefore, it can be concluded from this chart that the German government was consuming much of East Africa's funds, prohibiting them from growing economically. Previous to German influence, the GDP of East Africa was steadily increasing, especially between 1840 and 1860. Yet there is a drop in GDP afterwards until 1920, which signifies that Germany was embezzling funds from their colonies in East Africa. This chart further supports this theory, for as illustrated above, the GDP of Germany skyrocketed between 1870 and 1913, which includes the times of colonization of East Africa and many other African countries. In addition, the GDP plummets around 1919, which is when these colonies were taken away from Germany in the Treaty of Paris after they lost World War I. Therefore, it can be concluded from both charts that Germany used the colonies as an economic resource to increase their GDP as well as their overall economy, even to the disadvantage of the East African colonies. Governor Friedrich von Lindequist, who was a high colonel and official of the German Reich, pushed for the involvement of Germans in the fur industry. He wanted German colonists in Southwest Africa to act as resource producers of wool from the Bokhara for the domestic German fur industry. Von Lindequist studied the German expansion and colonization of West Africa closely. He aimed to create a strong trade of sheep wool in Southwest Africa and also made connections with the Russian leaders to bring black sheep down to Southwest Africa.